to our conversations with scientists. Today we are going to be discussing publishing, specifically peer-reviewed publishing. And so I'll remind everybody to mute your microphones if you're not speaking to minimize the noise. Let's see, today we have three wonderful panelists with us, and I'll start introducing them. First, we have Dr. Gabriel Gasque. Let's see, where are you, Gabriel? You can turn your microphone on and say hi so that people can see you.
Oh yeah, sorry, hello, I'm Gabriel.
There you go.
Can everybody, Monica, I'm sorry, I thought it was just me, but
No, it's not just you. I was muted. Yeah, see? All right, so I'll start with that again. So Dr. Gabriel Gasque is an associate editor at PLOS Biology. He was born and raised in Mexico City. He obtained his PhD in biochemistry from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or La UNAM. He did part of his experimental research at the University of Chile and in the Center for Scientific Studies in Chile as well, working on the physiology and biophysics of potassium channels. His doctoral thesis was awarded the Weizmann Prize by the Mexican Academy of Science for Best Dissertation in the Biological Sciences. Dr. Gasque received a Pew Fellowship to do postdoctoral research at Columbia University and the Rockefeller University in New York City, first working on synapse formation and later on the pharmacogenetics of appetite, and he has been part of the PLOS Biology editorial team since 2013. Welcome, Gabriel. Thank you for being with us. Next up, we have Dr. Carlos Rinaldi. Let's see. Don't make my mistake and turn on your microphone, Carlos, and say hello.
Hello, everybody.
So Carlos is the Charles A. Stokes Term Professor and Senior Associate Chair in the J. Creighton Pruitt Family Department of Biomedical Engineering.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
It is a mouthful. You have a lot of titles. In the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Florida. He received his bachelor's degree in chemical engineering at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez, and completed 2 master's degrees in chemical engineering and chemical engineering practice, and a PhD in chemical engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. Prior to the University of Florida, Dr. Rinaldi was an assistant station director of the MIT David H. Cook School of Chemical Engineering Practice and a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Puerto Rico, Mayagüez. I don't know how many times I said chemical engineering in just the last 2 minutes. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jean Mary Sarata. She is an associate editor at Nature Neuroscience. Say hello, Jean.
Hi, everyone.
So she joined the editorial team at Nature Neuroscience after completing several research projects in auditory cognition during her postdoctoral fellowship at the New York University, or NYU. She received her PhD in neuroscience from McGill University, where she conducted a series of fMRI studies on auditory motor integration at the Montreal Neurological Institute. So thank you, Jean, Carlos, and Gabriel for being with us. And so, without further ado, I am going to get started. So this was one of the topics that our fellows suggested that they wanted to hear more about. So in our program, we have selected topics when we start the year together, but the students also have the opportunity to suggest topics that they would like to hear about and have a conversation about. And this was one of the topics. So that means that I expect that you all are going to have tons of questions about publishing. But I would get started. Let me see if I can find my questions. Let's see. Okay. So I'm going to start with what, when, and where. And I'll ask all three questions together, and I'll remind you as we're progressing through the conversation. So the first question is, how do you decide what to publish? You know, as grad students, often you have many projects that you're working on. So how do you decide what to publish? How do you decide when to publish, when your research is ready to be submitted for publication? And how do you decide where to publish? Let's see. Let's start with Eugene.
So I think there's going to be an interesting balance between trying to show that you're productive as a student, a postdoc, or a professor. You want to have an overarching theme to your research, as everyone does. But then it's a matter of deciding when is it time to say that's enough for a paper. I think it first starts with which journal you're targeting at that point. And also, in terms of where specifically to publish, there is a mechanism in place. I think it's at a lot of journals called the pre-submission inquiry. So that's an easy way to get informal advice pretty quickly to say, these are the results that we have so far. And do you think that that's suitable for your journal? And it's the one time in which you can send that to more than one journal at the same time and see if there are at least one, if not more, journals that are interested in it, in your work.
Carlos.
So that's interesting. I've never done a pre-submission inquiry myself. How do you decide what to publish? So from my perspective is when you have a story, when you feel that you have a contribution, something that people haven't demonstrated before, you know, a new bit of knowledge. The question is how much is needed to really make a paper. And that will depend on the field. And, you know, when fields are young, I think the amount that's needed is less. When fields are very mature, you really have to do a good job of positioning what you've obtained or demonstrated in the context of everything else. I like to think about it as a sort of a conversation with the rest of the community. So that's what to publish. When? That's a great question. I try to tell my students to start writing their manuscripts early on because I feel that the exercise of writing an outline and starting to work on a draft is a good way of telling how far along are you in terms of completing that story. It's a good way of realizing where the holes are in the story. And where, there's two approaches to this. Sometimes you start a project and you know that it's going to be a high impact contribution because you know that the field has this gap and it's an important gap. And then in those few cases, because at least in my experience, those are the fewer cases, you sort of start out with a target journal. But if not, I think it's more important to focus on the science that you're doing. Do the work to the point where you feel that the story is complete, that the contribution is good, that the conclusions will stand the test of time, and then you have to look at your field and consider the wide range of journals that are in your field, and depending on how strong the contribution is, you choose something. You know, you try to go for something as high impact as possible. And then you sort of start working through the different journals available. That's the way we do it, at least.
I think a question from the chat that Gladys asked kind of goes well with what Carlos just said, and maybe it might be good for Gabriela and Jean to contribute their thoughts. So, Carlos, you just said that you have to shoot for the highest impact possible journal that you think your research would fit.
Not necessarily. So, I mean, this is something that hopefully an advisor will help a student choose where to start. You try to shoot for the highest impact journals that are appropriate for the contribution that you're reporting. Not everything should be submitted to Nature just because you want to start at the highest impact journal, right? You know, you have to really understand the literature. You have to be reading these journals. You have to know the type of work that's being published. That doesn't mean that if your work doesn't fit the scheme of the things that are being published, you're not going to submit. But you, after a while, you gain an understanding that, you know, well, you know, the contribution we made is suitable for a journal of quality interface science or something like that. Or maybe it's more suitable for ACS Nano at this stage. And I'm obviously talking about journals that I publish in, right? Someone, let me see, I'm not very good with the chat yet. So someone suggested checking previous papers to see if they fit with your work. That's always a good idea. If the majority of the papers you are making references to were published in a set of journals, and those are going to be good journals to submit to, because that's where the conversation is happening. You know, if everything that or most of the papers you're citing are in Langware, then Langware is a good journal to submit to if you're contributing to the conversation that's being had in the papers that you're citing. And then someone says there are good journals that are difficult to publish, but with a higher impact. Yeah, you know, higher impact and, you know, impact factors and the way we're being judged these days as scientists. You know, I have my experience with high impact publications, having started in Puerto Rico, is that it was very difficult to get anything past the editors when I submitted anything from Puerto Rico. I think if you're poorly known, if you don't have a track record of publication, sometimes it's difficult to get things even considered at a higher impact journal. But you should not, I think you should try. If you really think that what you're doing is a significant contribution to science, you should try for the high impact journals, because in the end, these are the journals that most people are continuously reading. So they're the ones that people are going to look at your work and they're going to pay attention to it quicker, and then they're going to cite them. And in the end, that's really what you're looking for. You're looking for to make a contribution that other people find useful and ultimately cite, right?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Carlos. Gabriel, do you want to share anything on these questions?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the questions is like, what, or the first question is like, what, when, and where to publish. And I think that, I mean, deciding when to publishing can be very circumstantial. You need to wrap up your postdoctoral research, and you can't get as much done as you would like to. And then you have to submit, and you feel you are not ready. But I would say that whatever you submit, you have to make sure that your conclusions are well supported by the data. It doesn't really matter where you submit, it has to be scientifically sound. And you have to be very honest, like don't oversell your findings, right? I mean, you have, obviously what you're doing, I will assume it's interesting. And you have to make to the editors very clear why it is interesting, but not oversell it. So be careful to adjust your conclusions to your data. And another thing I would like to expand on what Carlos said. I think that it's a good strategy to aim at the journal in which you believe your paper should be published. And to choose one paper, I will also suggest that you pay attention to what journals your colleagues read. Right? Not only about how impactful that journal is, but if you publish a piece of work that is on Drosophila neurogenetics, like where it's going to get the most extensive audience. And it might not necessarily be a really high impact journal. You know, there might be journals in which your colleagues are going to be reading or citing your work. Just to keep that in mind.
Great, guys. Thank you. So I know a lot of you have been publishing or have been wanting to set aside time to write. can I get a raise of hands? How many of you guys are currently at some stage of writing a paper or trying to publish a paper? And the people that are on the phone can just shout out. Great. So, who among you has had kind of a question about whether to shoot for a higher impact paper journal or maybe a safer journal? Maybe they would like to share their story. I was also interested, Gabriel, in what you said about not overselling. How do you know when you're overselling something? Like, what are some of the common mistakes that people make when they try to? And is that a very prevalent thing?
Is that a question directed to me?
Yeah, and then maybe Jean, if she wants to contribute as well as an editor.
I mean, I would say that a classical example would be when people are claiming to contributing to, they're contributing translational research or providing evidence for the cure of a human disease, and there is no human data whatsoever. I mean, that doesn't mean that you cannot study the biology underlying a disease in a model organism, right? But if in the manuscript you're claiming at providing cure or better understanding or better diagnosis without human data, that's really hard to sell. I mean, that's a common mistake, I would say. But there are others. I mean, it's not the only one.
What?
But,
Jean, what are other common mistakes that you see kind of new authors make when approaching publishing?
I think Gabriel's example is a pretty common one now, especially since there's an increased interest in mental health and psych disease and whatnot. But I think even in more basic levels of research, you can make strong claims about, let's say, wanting to address a debate that's been going on for about 10 years. And you have data that seems to support one side or the other. So there, it turns out you need to know the literature a little bit better, as Carlos had said. You need to know where this debate is really being discussed. Is it at what level? Is it at a Nature Science Cell level or papers of that particular high-profile audience, or is it more special for or specialized or specific to that particular community that other scientists in other slightly less related fields will be interested in? So that's a way of trying to determine, are your claims applicable to other related communities that might be interested in what you find? So if you're overstepping your claims in terms of how interesting it will be to a larger audience, that's another common mistake that we would see. And that cuts across all different types of work, from cellular and molecular all the way up to large-scale fMRI data that we see on a daily basis.
So, Ibelis, you have a interesting approach that a colleague takes to publishing their science. Do you want to share that?
One time I was going to a retreat in our pharmacology department, and they were just talking about these data that was almost complete, but they wanted to figure out where they wanted to publish. So they were like, oh, it's just more this type of journal. So I'm going to go back, sit down, and see what type of supplemental data they require and stuff like that. And I'm going to compile that data so that I can make it suitable for that specific journal. And then say that journal rejects it, then they're going to pick another one lower in the ladder, but then they're going to modify whatever they have accordingly. So because their argument was that it makes it more easy for them not to go, because when you're collecting data, you can go to many different routes. And what they were saying is that if you target a specific journal, you can make the process more faster.
So if I can comment, I think that approach, how should I put it? The strength of that, I think the important thing is really to read the journals that are related to your field and understand what the current status of the field is from the point of view of the assays and studies and level of data that people are basing their discussion on, okay? And the reason I say it like this is because it shouldn't be, I think it's a good idea in a sense, right? In that it's a good way for a student, someone who's just getting started, to rapidly acquaint themselves with what I just said. But ultimately, it shouldn't be about, I want to go into this journal, and so I'm gonna acquire the data that other papers in this journal have acquired. It should be about the investigator understanding what their community is basing the discussion on, what kind of observations, and therefore adapting that into your own work so that you make sure that whatever you do is something that you're going to be able to be part of the conversation, the discussion of a topic.
If I could add a little bit onto that, to just reiterate what Gabriel had said, I think the story is most important in this case. No matter which journal you're targeting or what level of audience you're targeting, you need to make sure that your claims are well supported by the data and by the analyses. So I think at least for the journals that are at Nature, the formatting does not specifically count at that type, how many types of data you're putting in your supplement to target what you think you see at that journal. I think so long as the story itself is well supported and you have as many different types of evidence to support that story, and then looking at your complete story, comparing it to the papers you've seen in your immediate community, scientific community, to see now where does that fall, that would be the right, that might be a better strategy as opposed to worrying about how to reformat again if it doesn't work at the journal that you originally targeted. I don't know if Gabrielle would like to follow up on that as well.
No, yeah, I agree. I mean, we don't pay attention to the format to begin with. You know, it's about the message, it's about the data, and then that's something we deal with if we have to eventually. But it's not a key determinant.
So one thing that I think has come up a little bit in the chat, but I don't think we have discussed directly, is the role of the editor in the process. And since Jean and Gabriel Gasque, you're both editors, it'd be nice to hear from you how it is that scientists interact with you. And Carlos, from your perspective, how it is that you as a scientist, when do you seek to engage and interact with the editors, and what do you seek from them? So whoever wants to start.
I could. That's fine. So, I mean, I would say that what we do as editors is like we select the content that our journals publish, and we use different criteria for that, right? I think that both Nature Neuroscience and PLOS Biology are quite selective journals. I don't know what the numbers of Nature Neuroscience are, but we reject without review about 80% of our submissions. And that's work that we do. We, the editors, decide whether we review or not. And so at PLOS Biology, we have a hybrid model in which every manuscript that we think might be suitable for us, we discuss it with an academic editor who's an active scientist and is a member of our board. So, and basically, the most common reasons why we reject a paper without review is because we believe that the study is addressing a specialized question that might not be of interest to a broad biology-oriented readership. And that, I would say that that's a criterion that also applies to journals like Nature or Science that target a really broad audience. And a second criterion will be that the level of the contribution is incremental. You know, like there's a lot of, it's what Carlos said at the beginning, you know, if it's a very well-trotted field, then usually the contribution has to be significant for us to consider it. And then if we like a story, if we like the conclusions, and we superficially believe that the conclusions are supported by the data, then we ask the expert, the real experts in the field, to review. And so we do the initial triage, and then we write a decision to the authors based on the review's comments. I will summarize my job in those terms.
I guess I could jump in and also say that Nature Neuroscience operates on a different model. So we do not have academic editors. The decisions are solely made by the editorial team. So it is made by the handling editor, the paper that the editor that's assigned to your paper, as well as a subset of the other editors and the chief. So the chief typically signs off on every single decision that we make, even if we don't send it out to review. For particularly difficult decisions, then the entire team will be roped in, and then we discuss the merits and the details of the study at hand. In terms of expanding beyond what we do on a daily basis, we also go out to conferences just so that we understand what the leading edge is, different subdisciplines of neuroscience specifically, and try to determine whether we need to start considering other types of research, because we know this is up and coming. We know that there's new technologies emerging that will allow us to get better insight that we hadn't seen before. And so now we might want to invite that kind of work to see how well that resonates with the rest of the community, like the peer reviewers that we invite to look at these types of papers. We also do lab visits so that we can meet more one-on-one with the principal investigators, some of the trainees as well, to find out what they're doing, to see if there's anything of interest as well on that level, and maybe invite potential pieces of work to submit it to our journal to see if we can discuss it amongst the other editors and perhaps send it out to review. Since we only make decisions among the editorial team, sometimes if we are all on the fence, then we will contact an expert in the field for some informal advice. And then we may just make a final decision whether or not to send it out to review from that point on. And right now we're trying to send any decision with a lot of specification of rationale for why we make those decisions, so that it's important. We try not to send form letters anymore, because that's not really respectful of the amount of work that you've done. I'm trying to see what else type. I think that pretty much covers the rest of it.
Gabriel, you wanted to add something else?
Yes, I would like to expand into very interesting things that Jean said, and one of them is we do go to conferences and talking to young scientists. It's something that I realize many of them don't know, but we editors at different journals try to recruit papers. We go to conference and talk to scientists, go to the posters, go to the oral sessions, and we ask the authors if we believe the story will be a good fit for PLOS Biology or Nature Neuroscience. We invite the authors to submit to us. So when you attend a conference, don't be shy. If you know that editors are around, go and talk to them and pitch your story. And you will see that if you have an interesting piece of research, editors will invite you to submit, you know. And the other thing that I was going to say, which is about providing feedback and listening to the reviewers. I get many papers that have been reviewed elsewhere. And even if you get a rejection, once your paper has been reviewed, pay attention to what the reviewer said. You know, your community is significantly small. So when you submit to the third or fourth journal, those editors are going to be inviting the same reviewer that had seen the paper before. And I can tell you it's pretty annoying for the reviewers to see a paper that has been reviewed 2 or 3 times before, and you decided not to revise. So my advice, working for a non-top tier journal, is that listen to your reviewers from previous journals if your submission wasn't successful.
Oh, I think that's great advice. As a reviewer myself, whenever I get a paper that I've reviewed before, you know, if they haven't addressed any of my comments and they just submitted it again, that editor gets a confidential letter from me, you know, saying that this is a waste of my time. Okay, so my perspective, I'm actually associate editor at a journal, and a much lower tier journal than some of the ones that are represented here. In my experience there is mostly dealing with going through reviewer reports and author responses and being, you know, making decisions as to what gets published or not. My experience as an author, I don't really interact a lot with editors, to be honest. Part of it is, it's, I guess, it wasn't very common when I started out my career. Also, I'm going to be honest, I was very shy going to conferences. Then I started my career at the University of Puerto Rico, and I felt like a little fish in a very large pond. And so I didn't feel comfortable going up to an editor and telling them about the work that I was doing. My experience with the editorial rejection process, editorial review process, I'm going to be very honest, and I'm going to say that it has not been good, and has sometimes felt to be very unfair. I can tell you about a situation where I submitted a paper to a high impact journal in nanotechnology, and boarded a plane, and when I arrived at the other side, the paper had been rejected editorially. And I wrote to the editor and I asked, you know, how can you make this decision so quickly, and what is the basis of this decision? And the editor said that he reviewed 5 to 6 papers every day, and that he had reached a level where he could tell if a paper was going to be accepted or not in the journal. Fortunately, I knew another associate editor in the journal with whom I had discussed the work, and they overturned the decision, and the paper was accepted in 3 weeks. And it's a very highly cited paper in the field, where it was the first time we demonstrated certain phenomena in nanoparticles. So I understand the why there's this triage system. You know, the pressure that journals that are really high impact have in terms of the number of papers that they received and what they can reasonably publish is incredible. So it's a necessary, I'm going to say it's a necessary evil of the process. I don't interact a lot with the editors because many of the journals where I publish, the editors are faculty. They're not journals where you have professional editors. I think that's very common in engineering journals. I think it's very common in chemistry journals, unless you go to, you know, to the Nature and journals. So in that case, it's very difficult to, if they don't know you personally, if you don't know them personally from conferences, you're wasting your time sending them an email. You know, some of them will be nice and respond, but you have to realize that these people are extremely busy. So, I mean, that's been my experience. I think it's very valuable to be very social and network a lot at conferences, but some of us are better at it than others. And me, I haven't been good at it. And what I've published in the higher impact journals has been after a lot of attempts and blood, sweat, and tears. So.
If I could respond to a couple of points that I've heard. I don't think that anyone should be afraid. I can speak personally and say that I was never really good at networking while I was at conferences as a researcher when I was active in the field. And then I learned on the other side after becoming an editor that so long as it seems that we're approachable, and I would imagine that we are, because editors are there to look for the newest type of research, solid research. And they're there to network with the young scientists, the established scientists, some of our authors and some of our reviewers as well, and try to just establish connections in that way. I think that, well, at least for professional editors, because this is within our purview, this is our job. If you get a rejection letter and you want to talk to the editor, you should contact the editor and see if you can schedule a phone call, because as your handling editor, I would know your paper the best, and I would be willing to spend 30 minutes on the phone with you to discuss the merits a little more in detail than what you had seen in the decision letter. So I don't think that anyone should be afraid of reaching out to the editor to ask for a little more clarification on the desk rejection. And also to touch upon something that I'd heard from earlier on, in my view, I don't believe that that the rich get richer. That just because we've published from the same lab, that just because we've published from the same institute or university, that means we will only pay attention to that type of work and understand that kind of caliber. If there is good, solid work, again, it does not matter where it comes from. It just needs to be well supported, and that the claims are close to what the data say and they don't overstep what the data say. It really, in my view, we don't look favorably upon institutions, particular PIs, or particular labs.
Does anybody have a follow-up question about the topics of talking with editors, or maybe approaching people who know the journals you want to publish in, or maybe share their own stories?
I have a question.
Yeah, great. Lynette, go ahead.
Okay. I was wondering, once you submit a paper and you get it, you receive it and you have all the comments from the editors, how many of the experiments that were suggested by the reviewers should one complete? And let's say that you do have time, they suggest 10 experiments, but you realize that you only have time to complete 8. How should you, how can you convince the reviewers that you only want to complete 8, or you only have the time, without, getting them upset or just getting the paper rejected?
You want me to do that one first? I mean, sure, I want to hear the perspective of the editors, right? That's a great question. It's not about a number or a minimum number of experiments or things that you have to do. You have to consider the reviewer's comments, and you have to figure out which ones are valid and which ones are not. You have to understand, the literature and why someone is asking for something, and then you have to decide. And if you do the experiment, you try to do things that will make your paper better, and you try to argue against things that are just unreasonable. And there will be things that are unreasonable, because if someone wants to delay you from publishing a paper because they're working on something similar, they will ask you to do a lot of experiments, and that happens. I mean, it definitely happens. So personally, what I do is is I sit down with my students and we go over point by point, and we write a response to the reviewer before we do anything. And we try to go over the points and try to figure out which ones are really solid points, right, that the reviewer has raised, and which ones are not. And we try to figure out what is the minimum number of experiments that we need to do in order to address the most important points. And then we try to, for the others, we try to figure out, based on what we already did, based on what we have in the paper, and based on what's in the literature, whether what they're asking for is reasonable or not. And if it's not, we back it up. I am a very combative author. I am the kind of author that, will fight back. I will not just lay down and do whatever they ask me for, because sometimes it's not reasonable. And also, I guess it's based on my PhD training. But ultimately, you also have to realize that if you don't do any of the experiments that they're suggesting, they're just going to reject you, right? And it's very easy for the reviewer to write a letter to the editor saying, these authors did not consider any of my suggestions, and I was being very helpful, and I wanted them to improve the paper, and they didn't do any of it. And then you're going to put the editor in a very difficult position, because they're asking the reviewer for feedback. You're ignoring it, and then they're saying that you shouldn't be accepted. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you can't get away. You have to figure out which ones you have to do, which ones you can do, which ones are good, and you cannot always get away with, I'm not going to do any of these things. I think that was a bit jumbled in the end, but
I'm gonna. Sorry, I'm. Go ahead, Lynette.
Oh, some people have suggested that a good strategy is to hold back some experiments that are not crucial for the paper, but that are obviously going to be asked for by the editors. I don't know if that's also a good strategy, and also to start working on potential experiments as soon as you submit the paper.
I personally don't like that idea. And the reason is, if you know that something might be brought up, just put it in the paper. If it's important, put it in the paper. I mean, don't try to game the system by sort of holding back information that you think people will ask you, that it's obvious that they will ask you for it. You're going to get a bad reputation. You're going to get a harsh first review if that information should have been there. And also, you're sort of, in a sense, you're either doing it because you want to write another paper along the same lines, which sort of means that you are compartmentalizing the study, which is something that's really bad for science. You should do complete studies. Don't just stop here and then, because this is good enough for a paper and I'm going to use the rest for the second paper. What we do is we continue working on the research, right? We submit the paper, and of course the student has a thesis, and they're going to write more than one paper. They're doing several studies. And then when the reviews come back, if it turns out that some of the experiments that we were doing anyway are helpful, then we use them. But consciously holding back data, I think that's a bad idea.
I'm going to ask Gabriel to comment because he has to leave soon. Yeah. So Gabriel, do you want to add to that? You're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes. No, I fully agree with Carlos. Like, keeping data, like guessing what the reviewers are going to ask I've heard it before. I heard it as a scientist, and it didn't make sense in the past, and it doesn't make sense as an editor either. I mean, I think that in general, like we editors and get two types of, or we see the experiments that are suggested by the reviewers are two types. So one type is like, the conclusions are not supported by the data, right? So controls are missing, experiments are missing just to support the current claims. And then we have the other set of experiments, which are like, everything in this paper is nice and fine, but to be a PLOS biology paper, the authors will have to show 3 levels more of like understanding, right? It's like bringing the paper to a new level. And I think that both concerns are valid, depending on the journal in which you are submitting to. And you have to, what Carlos said, you have to consider like whether those experiments are really necessary. And even though it entails a lot of work for editors, if you are unsure about how much to revise experimentally, engage with the editors before starting your revision. You know, we are very approachable. And as Jean said, like we also at PLOS Biology try to be very directive in the decision letter. And we will say, I mean, for us to consider your revision, you have to address these 3 points. And then these other points are nice to have, but won't be necessary for publication. But if you don't get that letter, it's absolutely valid to go back to the editor and say, from the 30 experiments the reviewer suggested, I want to do these 10. And I mean, be aware that that might be a rejection, right? I mean, the editor might consider that that is not enough, but the cards are going to be on the table, right? So approach the editor and propose a revision. And I think I had another comment, but I forgot. Oh yeah, like if you know your study has a limitation, right? Be very upfront. Use your cover letter for that, right? We have accepted papers that the authors come to us and say, like, this is what we have, and this is what we don't have. And our manuscripts have been submitted elsewhere, and this point that we don't have, we will not have, right? Are you willing to review with that caveat? And if we take it to reviewers knowing that limitation, very likely, even if the reviewers bring up that point, we are going to fight for your paper because we decided to review it knowing the limitation, right? If you try to hide it or pretend it doesn't exist, then when the reviewers come back saying like, okay, but this piece of information is missing, then our hands are tied, right? Like we will side very likely with the reviewers. And just one last point, I fully agree with Carlos that if you submit a revision that doesn't contain any of the experiments that was suggested, that you only rebut it, then very likely your paper is going to be rejected.
Jean, do you have anything to add? If so, I want to get to a couple of other questions on the chat. If you don't have.
Yeah, I just to quickly follow up, I think I agree exactly with what Carlos and what Gabriel had said. That's where you go to your editor. The editor is supposed to guide you through the reviewers and tell you what's important for them to consider it a successful revision and even determine whether or not they will send it back to the reviewers. So there are times where if you didn't reach out to your your editor at the time and discuss your revision plan ahead of time, if you come back and you're argumentative and don't do any of the work or only do one thing to address the reviewer concerns, then we, at least at Nature Neuroscience, can say, you know, that's not sufficient enough. Oh, my Gabriel. Nice to meet you. And also I noticed, at least in the chat, if there are concerns about time or lack of money to finish the experiments, that would address some of the reviewer concerns. These are things that you want to also bring up to the editor. So most oftentimes, at least at Nature Neuroscience, we're aware of the types of data that are coming into it. I agree with Gabriel that it's good to acknowledge your limitations right up front. If not, also in the cover letter, also in the discussion, just save that so we know what the limitations of the data set and the analyses are. So for instance, one of the most rarest data set we'll have in neuroscience will be direct intracortical recordings from human patients. Right? These are very rare. These are epileptic patients. You can probably only get 5 if you're lucky. And so it would be very unfair for a reviewer to say, we need you to go get 5 more because your data are not robust. So there is a very clear case where we will not side with the reviewer in that point, on that case. And if there are things that we are not aware of, again, you'd bring it up with your editor. And if you want to rebut it in your response to the reviewers, you should say it in a respectful tone, so we are not able to do this. It would take X number of years to get that kind of data, but we have done this analysis to try to get to that concern. So always try to be responsive in some way. That's probably everything I had to add.
Great. I'm going to go next to Omar, who has kind of a follow-on question about responding to reviewers, and then I'm going to go to Daisha and also to Carlos. Go ahead, Omar.
Hi. So my question is more, so my question is more about this is experience about one of my partners in the lab. She recently graduated, Dr. Frances Senon, and she submitted a paper to the journal, one of the journals, and she had 3 reviewers, and after a couple of months, she got her review backs, and one of the reviewers was a little aggressive. We think that it wasn't fair, most of the reviews and the suggestion that the reviewer asked her to do. So anyway, she did those experiments, and after a couple of time later, the reviewer was again addressing some of the same points that were answered with the new experiments. So my question is, at what point do we have to address that reviewer demands, and in what case can we take out the reviewer out of the process of reviewing? And yes, that's my question.
Jean, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I can. So I think you're referring to possible reviewer bias in this particular case. And I think, I've seen many cases in which a reviewer just delivers his or her opinions in a very negative light. So what we try to do is take a step back and look at what the actual concerns are. Are they actually in line with the other reviewers' concerns? Do we agree with those overall concerns? So even if you have a very negative reviewer who just keeps sticking on a particular point, if they seem to be in line with the other 2 reviewers per se, we will still keep that in mind moving forward, and we want to see a sufficient revision for that. If you are concerned about reviewer bias, this is definitely something that you want to flag to the editor. So again, it's a matter of asking for a phone call or saying in a cover letter when you send in a revision, we are concerned about reviewer bias, this particular reviewer. It will be up to the editor to decide whether or not they want to replace that person and have someone else with a similar expertise review in those concerns, that particular reviewer's concerns. And I have done that from time to time. So we do take these concerns of reviewer bias seriously, but we are already experienced enough to strip ourselves away from the negativity in which they're wrapped. So we do that on a rare occasion.
Okay.
I want to add to that. So definitely, in my experience, there's lots of reviewers who post the silliest things in the most negative tone. They're being overly critical, etc. You really have to look at the other reviews, and if you have 2 very strong positive reviews, you might be in a better position to argue about one reviewer. You have to be nice in every response. Although I'm gonna admit that every now and then I lose my temper. I have written responses to reviewers where I'm basically saying this reviewer is committing factual, is making factually inaccurate statements, or this reviewer is misrepresenting our work. I mean, don't be afraid to fight back. If you think that you're not being treated correctly and you're trying to address a reviewer, don't be afraid to be firm about what you think and about your responses to the reviewer's concerns. In my experience, I've had a few papers where we can't get the reviewer to agree, and the editors, depending on the journal, they send it to another reviewer who basically acts as an arbiter. And that happens a lot in journals where you don't have, again, professional editors, right? It'll be sent to another scientist, and that scientist will basically read your responses to the reviewer. They'll read the reviewer comments, they'll read the paper, and they'll make a recommendation to the editor. I've done that myself. So it happens. So don't be too discouraged if it's happening to you.
Great. Thank you both for your advice. Daisha, you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I also, if it's okay if I could add to that, because I had that same experience that you were talking about. I had 5 reviewers from one of my papers, and I wrote a rebuttal letter, and the same reviewer came back saying, oh no, this hasn't been addressed and everything, but all the other 4 agreed with everything that has been revised. So then we went back to the editor and asked, 4 of the 5 reviewers have agreed with the changes. Is it okay to accept it? Do I still have to address this 3rd reviewer who doesn't seem to give up? And they actually said, yes, like, you're okay, you can publish. So they accepted it. So it's a good advice to always talk to the reviewers, because you sometimes have people that don't want to take a no for an answer. So my question was more in terms of a career advice. So what are you doing in a situation when you are API and you are spend a lot of time for a journal reviewing papers? Do you have sort of, not a free ticket, but sort of like a little bit of a bias that journal might let you pass to the reviewer process better? Like, be like, oh, we're going to pass it because this person has put so much effort into it, or it's like, doesn't matter at all? Or in terms of career-wise, when you're a scientist and you're reviewing, what's the gains and loss of this process? Because there's a lot of time spent of scientists reviewing other people's work. What's the balance there? That's my question.
I guess I can start. I've never felt or thought that by reviewing I'm going to get a pass or a special treatment at a journal. Yeah, it's just not the way we run the scientific enterprise, at least not in my experience, and I hope not in anybody's experience. You review papers because it's your responsibility as a scientist, right? You want to do it because you want science to advance. You do it because you want to make sure that the conversation remains according to the principles of the scientific method. And so you do it because you care about your field, I think, foremost, right? Some journals are now sending, you do it also because if, let's say you have an academic position, one of the things that I fill out in my annual activity reports is my service as a reviewer. And so you do it also from that point of view. You get some, I guess, brownie points when you're getting reviewed in your job. But I'm going to be honest, my chair probably cares more about how much money I'm bringing in and how many papers I'm publishing than about how many papers I'm reviewing. So I do it because I think it's my responsibility as a scientist. I will confess that when I get a lot of editorial rejections at a journal and then they ask me to review, I don't have time. But that's me being petty. I'm gonna admit it. That's me being childish. Yeah, that's it. I don't know what else to say.
I can jump in and say that in my view, because a person has reviewed for several times doesn't necessarily give them a free pass for a paper that they then submit afterwards. You would hope that by reviewing for a particular journal, they would learn the standards, the types of work that would pass muster at that particular journal, and then would hopefully adjust the types of submissions that they then send to that journal. And if it doesn't quite work, hopefully with a properly customized letter explaining the rationale for, let's say, a desk rejection or a rejection after review, they would understand why, and then they would move on. With respect to, let's say, reviewing a lot and then, just getting rejected or desk rejected and then being asked to review, at least at our journal, we try to keep that in mind. So if we just rejected someone's paper and we know that we've used this person many times, we usually give them a break, and don't ask that person for a while. We check to make sure that we didn't just reject a paper from them before we asked them to review, or at least we try to in most cases.
So Carlos, are you on your cell phone?
Carlos de Leon, because we have two Carlos.
I'm sorry, Carlos de Leon.
Yes.
Oh, do you want to ask the question you had earlier?
Sure. Basically, it was like, how do you think the publishing and how we share science is gonna change the news in the next years?
Yeah, in case you couldn't hear that clearly, so Carlos was asking about the publication environment and how it might change in the future and what that might mean for scientists looking to publish their research.
So I could start. I've met with some younger or scientists that have told me that they think preprint servers are really helpful at this point because they are trying to get high-profile papers out there, and they realize that the review process can take quite a while, more than 6 months sometimes, because they have to revise and then resubmit and wait for the reviewers to send in their feedback yet again. So in the meantime, what they'll do is they'll deposit a paper, the initial paper, a preprint, as proof. They came up with the idea first, or they came up with this finding first, or really to show productivity, right? Because I think I had said this all the way at the beginning, perhaps not as well as hopefully now, but you have to strike a balance between being productive and showing that you have a high output of papers versus perhaps getting one high profile paper every once in a while to give yourself a competitive edge when you're going on the market for a professor position or whatever have you, or a postdoc. So a good way of doing that is at least saying, this is one set of experiments for this particular story, placed on a preprint server, and then we'll send it to a journal of our choice and have it peer reviewed, hopefully, and see how that goes along. So I think that's already changing the landscape of how we disseminate research, because people are already citing these preprint servers, these papers, just to say this before that comes out in another journal, in a peer-reviewed journal, that concept exists or that finding exists. Trying to think other ways. And certainly once papers are out there, even, the social media is a big thing. So I think a lot of journals and publishing houses are starting to increase their presence on all social media to try to interact and on forums with their scientists, with their authors and reviewers. So I think we're trying to keep up with what's happening now, because we know it's not just a print, it's not print issues anymore. We know it's a lot more interactive at this point.
Carlos, have you had any experience with preprint or giving advice to students interested in publishing in preprint repositories?
I know about preprints because they're very common in the fluid mechanics and physics literature, and I read some of that. But I've never submitted into a preprint, and I don't think it's as common in the fields that I'm publishing in now. Maybe I'm wrong. I think it's an interesting idea, a cool idea, but you have to be aware that whatever's in there hasn't passed peer review yet. So, I don't know about that. I think Jean mentioned again the idea of the pressure to publish, or the need to balance going to a high impact journal versus, getting something published soon. I'm going to say that from my own experience, when I was starting my career, I purposely avoided the highest impact journals because I thought I was going to be wasting my time. And in the end, what matters is to get your work through the peer review process and published and available so that other people can see it. And so I focused primarily on journals that were respectable and were indexed so that they would be available on search engines, because ultimately, pretty much everybody these days, if they're looking for something, material on a topic, you do a search. And if the journal that you're publishing is indexed, then hopefully people, if you wrote your title well and your abstract well, the people will find it. So.
Yeah, I think related to what you're mentioning, Carlos Rinaldi, it's open access. So, it goes along with the preprint. I've heard a lot of people that have, they're trying to make a decision whether or not publish open access versus maybe a journal that is paywall but has higher impact. Particularly, I think this is particularly important for young scientists. Because they're trying to establish their careers, and so that is a concern. It's too bad that Gabriel had to leave because he's PLOS Biology is an open access journal. But I don't know if you've had any experience with, or had to make the decision of, do I go to an open access journal, or because of how it may impact your career down the road.
So I'm actually associate editor in an open access journal. It's an international journal of nanomedicine. I've published there a few times. What ends up happening is that being open access, then scientists all around the world in countries that probably have less resources, where universities don't have the money to buy, journal subscriptions, they get to read it and they cite it, right? And so that's one benefit. I like the idea. I guess I don't have a problem with the idea of open access. But I don't think I've ever decided on a paper, I'm going to submit this to an open access journal because I want more people to see it. I just look at what we did and I think about what are the right journals for the conversation, and that's where I submit.
If I could jump in on that, I think in response to the open access journal, certainly a lot of the publishing houses are trying to come out with at least one open access journal. So certainly Nature has an open access journal called Nature Communications. But also now for papers that are behind a paywall, they've partnered up with ReadCube. So if you go on to any of our papers online, you can share a link that would allow you read-only access to that paper. That should be able to work behind the from behind the paywall. So even if you can't pay for access, your institution doesn't have access, you should be able to technically read that paper.
That's an interesting one. I had not seen that, so that's pretty cool.
Okay, guys, do we have another question for our panelists related to publications or peer review or review, dealing with responses?
I think Monica had a bunch of questions, and I think there's a really good one, and that is, how do you deal with rejection?
That one stuck with you.
That
one stuck with you.
No, I just have your questions right next to the view, and yeah, it's you will deal with rejection a lot if you're a scientist. You will deal with rejection because your experiments reject you. They don't work. You will deal with rejection because papers get rejected all the time, even if you're established. I mean, so. When I started out, I had a really hard time dealing with rejection. It would take me a long time to muster the courage or commitment to work on it again. These days, I think I do it a little quicker, and I try to force my students to do a little quicker. What you have to look at why you were rejected, and sometimes you are rejected because your work is not good enough. And you have to be willing to be honest with yourself, if that's the case. Sometimes you're rejected because the editors did not feel that it was a good fit for their journal. You should not take that personally. You should move on quickly as possible. If it's editorial rejection. sometimes you're rejected because reviewers, you know, were not fair, and you weren't able to convince everybody, and that. But then you have to consider it, and you have to work on it, and you have to improve it, and then submit it again. Don't let rejection bring you down. You know, work hard at it, work soon at it. Don't waste too much time. And if you really think that your work is good and it's worthy of publication, just pick up the pieces, improve upon it, and submit it again as quickly as possible.
If I could jump in, I certainly, as a researcher, have been on the receiving end of rejections. And even now, for the rare time that I write things, I still have to get negative feedback from my own colleagues to say, you could have said this better. I don't think I like that. The way that this piece is going, and you go back. I think it's a matter of reading it, having your reaction to it, and then take a step back for one moment. Revisit it again and try to figure out what are the messages there, what are their critiques behind the negative wrapping, behind the potential bias, because the reviewers are hopefully trying to help you and give you constructive feedback ultimately. And you're supposed to be able to take that, just to reiterate what Carlos says, take that feedback, improve the manuscript, deciding where you go, if you go back to that same journal or you move on. Because it's only going to make the paper stronger, the analysis stronger, and the ultimate conclusion stronger for wherever it ends up publishing. So it's a matter of reading it, reacting the way you need to react, and then come back in a day, and then really try to figure out what they're all trying to say, the editor and or the reviewers.
I like Omar's question, and I want to hear Jean's position on this. Omar is asking, can grad students be reviewers? Are there any opportunities for us to do some reviewing?
So usually it would be a senior grad student co-supervised by their PI. So we don't typically go to a grad student on our own. We need to make sure that they're trained to our standards. And so hopefully it will be someone that's familiar with the journal standards and that they are that they're supervised. We allow it for training purposes. Same goes for postdocs that aren't quite established in the field. So long as the more established PI that we do know and are familiar with will have final say on what's being said. And we always ask those PIs to note it in the comments to us or say it in an email, and I try to take note of it. And hopefully that person will stay in our roster. So for the next time a paper comes in, maybe that person has become even more senior or has found a position and can then become a reviewer on their own independently from the original PI.
So good. So now that Jean has said what the expectation of the editors is, I'm going to say what I do in my lab. I review most of them by myself. I sometimes wish that I would delegate more or get help from my students more. But I do it by myself mostly. And every now and then when I see a paper that I think it would be a good exercise for my students to review, I give it to them and I ask for their feedback. And then very often I don't use their feedback and I just write a review by myself, but I then sit down with them and I show them my review of the paper and we go over both of them, because to me it's a training exercise. And sometimes they write very good reviews, more detailed than I would have written. But many times, especially when they're starting out, they're not going to do that. But just the exercise of reading someone else's paper and being asked the question, is this worthy of publication, is a great way for them to start thinking about their own work from the point of view of when will it be ready for publication.
I think we have 15 minutes left, so I think maybe that might be the last question. Kelvin, do you want to ask it?
Sure, I'll ask it. Hi, hola Gasque. Okay, so my question is about literature review papers. Like, how are they differently reviewed from data papers. What do you think makes it the most different when you're reviewing them? And can somebody like me, like a nobody, like successfully publish a review paper?
So for review papers, we usually ask reviewers to comment while we ourselves read the paper and figure out whether the topic is appropriate, the scope of the type of literature that's reviewed, and the statement that's ultimately being made by reviewing that literature. Is that within the scope of the journal? Would that be interesting enough for our broad audience, because it's not just one type of neuroscience that we are publishing for? And yeah, I think it's a matter of, do we recognize this person and with their contribution to the field? So that entails a little bit of legwork, especially if it's in an area that we normally don't see, or a topic that we normally don't see. So we do a background search in terms of PubMed, try to see the types of papers that are out there. So that also means the novelty of that literature review. If there was something that was just published within X number of months or a year, and it's saying something very similar, then that already scoops the literature review. In terms of the review process, if we decide let's give this a chance and see what the experts think, they are asked to see if it, one, is novel enough, if it is representative of the literature that speak to that particular topic or that argument, and if it is unbiased, if it is a balanced point of representation of the field, unless it is a perspective. So we also have balanced literature reviews and a perspective where they use the literature to make a particular point and make a particular argument or interpretation of the data so far, the published data. But even in that case, we ask for a balanced representation before you make that argument. So I hope that answers to some extent your question.
So reviews. I did not write a lot of reviews when I started my career because I thought I'd rather be doing primary literature. I'd rather be doing experiments and contributing to the discussion rather than rehashing the discussion. Also, I wasn't being invited. Now I get invited to write reviews all the time, and I don't have enough students to write them. And also I try to get them to write primary papers. How useful it is for your career. So reviews tend to get cited very highly. And so if you're worried about citation numbers, etc., they're valuable. But I'm going to tell you, in every single search committee that I've participated in, when we look at a potential faculty candidates publication list, we make a point of distinguishing between the reviews and the primary literature. And reviews get second billing. I mean, they're not as important from the point of view of deciding who to hire. I mean, there are scientists out there who have really high impact, really high H indices and really high citations because they've written a couple of influential reviews, but they're not really contributing much to the discussion. I mean, I think you should write a review in your field for yourself. As a junior scientist, write it for yourself. And then if it's really good, shop it around, talk to editors. But you do it for yourself because you do it as an exercise of understanding the literature and positioning your ideas, right? And then if you're lucky enough to meet an editor, or maybe you just shop it around and someone accepts it, or maybe you get invited to write a review and then you have it ready and then you submit it. But I wouldn't consciously think about, I'm going to write a review this year if I'm just starting out my PhD, or if you're starting out your career as an independent investigator, let's say you have an assistant professor position. I've heard some people give the advice that you sort of try to do one after 3 years. You sort of get on a cycle. Every couple of years you write one, but definitely don't do too many of them. Focus on the primary literature. Focus on doing the science, contributing to the discussion that way. That's my personal view.
Yeah, I'm going to share my experience, and it seems like it's similar to a couple of other people on the chat. So if your PI is generally asked to write review papers, you might let them know that you would be interested in working with him or her on a review publication, particularly if you're at a stage in your training or your research where you still have a couple of years to go. You don't have a pressure already to write a data paper, and maybe you're like in the process of doing yourself literature review. It's a great way of merging that literature review that you have to do anyway into a publication. And Carlos is right, you know, data papers are what most people focus on, but as a graduate student, if your review paper is cited, it means people are reading it, it means people thought your analysis of the field was good, and, you know, it's still something that will be looked upon really well in the next step for you. All right, any final comments or maybe a quick question if somebody has? We have just a few minutes left.
I have a quick comment.
Sure, Lena.
My PI was asked to write a chapter on the disease that we were studying, and he asked me to write it, and it was great because I was able to use that as the introduction chapter for my thesis. So they do take a lot of time, and it was very challenging for me to write the document. He helped me a lot, but then I had chapter 1 of my thesis ready. So it's a great opportunity.
Good point. Jean and Carlos, are there any words of encouragement or advice you want to leave the students with before we sign off?
I can just say that don't be afraid to reach out to your editor, regardless of what stage. I think a lot of students and even PIs don't realize that they can ask for a phone call and talk to them at every stage to discuss the decision, the reviews, the revision plan, what the next steps are. I think you should just realize that they're there, and they know your paper, and they know your work. And if you see them at a conference, or at least you recognize their name badge, don't be afraid to say hello either. And I think I saw that in the chat. Look them up. If it's tweeted that they're going to be at that conference, look to see if you can find a picture and approach them. Don't believe that your institution or that your lab matters. If it is a good, solid piece of work and an interesting story, it will be considered. And I think, because of this networking opportunity, you can always feel free to reach out and say hello, and that we've met this way, and you can feel free to follow up with any questions. I can write my email in the chat box later.
Work hard, play hard. You're young scientists, work hard at it, but don't forget to also enjoy life. I guess that's the piece of advice I'm going to give you. And the other thing I'm going to say is this is the best job in the world. I love being a professor. I love working with students. I love doing research. There's rejection. There's a lot of talk about bad things in academia and in science these days. But, if you're passionate about research and science, don't let any of that deter you. Work at it, persevere. And I hope you're all successful.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlos and Jean. We all appreciate the time you gave us and you've put forth. They've shared their emails. We'll send them to you guys as well. Feel free to contact them for additional insights or to network. But yeah, thanks everybody for participating. Monica, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to.
No, I wanted to say thank you to Gabriel, although he had to leave. I appreciate him being here while he was able to. So thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Gabriel, Jean, and Carlos, for your time and for your insights. Thank you to the fellows for their questions and their comments, and we will see you next time. Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.